This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Provincial Britain, a train station, a mission. The mission is Oliver Darkshire. His new book, Once Upon a Tome, tells the adventures, or the subtitle correctly, the misadventures of a rare bookseller. Once upon a tome, Oliver traveled to a provincial station in Britain on a mission off-site to look at a collection of books in the chance that there were rare books. That's an important distinction. Oliver, a hearty congratulations and a very good evening to you. Please describe what you learned as you got off the train and then sought your rare bookseller moment at a home that I pictured as having many turrets and lots of Victorian touches, but inside was a library. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. As I stepped off the train, it was one of those. It was one of those train stations. When I say in the middle of nowhere, I mean there were trees, some steps to come down off it, and then no signposts, no directions, no town really. There was a road, if you can call it that, with several roads spiraling off it. And I realized that firstly I should have bought a map or someone with me. I was too proud, you see. I wanted to. Every bookseller wants to find rare things by themselves. You want to discover them, so I thought, how hard can it be? My first outing by myself as a rare bookseller. I'll find this house. I've got an address on a letter that was sent to us. And I'll find my way there, a short walk from the station, they said to me. So I got off the train thinking that I would find, directions on a map or something, or I'd ask around if there was anyone to ask. And I ended up wandering quite far out of my way, it turns out, actually. I had to cross through through the woods. I had to go through the woods. I didn't drive, you see. I made a terrible mistake. And a short walk. It was not a short walk. I'm not going to say they lied to me, but I will say that maybe it was shorter in their minds than it was in practice. It was more of a trek or a hike, really. Through a section of woods where there were trails. I call them trails more than a path. Unfortunately, you had my modern doodad, my phone on me to try and find directions when it was working. But really, I just walked in the direction that I thought was the right way, over through trails across a disused railway bridge, down the other side through a cornfield, lots of crows, until eventually I stumbled across this house. And your description of it is quite accurate. I mean, there weren't turrets, might be a strong word, but crenellations, I think. There were definitely, it was quite very tall. There were statues everywhere. Topiary, sort of. Somebody once had maintained these bushes at some point in the past. If you can imagine that they were once in the shape of an animal, but they've kind of outgrown.
Yes.
So they're no longer in the shape of an animal and more like a cloud.
Everything is screaming eccentric to you. And of course, that's a moment where you might have hit gold. There's always going to be the treasure that you're going to find that nobody else knew. Inside the house, you're introduced to a library. What did you find in the library immediately? Because you read it right away.
We walked into the room. They said, here are some books that this relative of ours has left behind. She's left 3 rooms full of books, several of them moldy French books. Was the first thing. I don't read any French. I didn't think to tell me before I got there, and they expected me to, so I didn't tell them, I'm sorry, I don't read French after I'd come all this way. So I had to pretend to read French for about an hour in the first room before I had told them that I don't really know what I can do with these because they don't have any covers. And there might be bugs in them. There are holes where bugs should go. I'm not sure where the bugs are now, but there were bugs at one point before they got bored. And they showed me through 1 or 2 of these rooms where they were rifling through the furniture. The main collection it turns out, was I want to say spiritual works. And I say spiritual in the sense that they were quite sinister. Mostly about exorcisms and, how to rid your domicile of demons and, what to do in this event of a spiritual event.
At this point, Oliver, in reading your book, I had to make sure this wasn't fiction because I thought you were about to disappear and your friends would come looking for you some week. And
They might not have.
someone would call it Holmes and Watson's and say, Oliver was a nice fellow and he disappeared into this house. The reason I ask you to tell this story is because I think you have just described your adventures becoming a bookseller. You went through winding paths and you wound up someone who enjoys a great deal telling the story of a very famous shop. Let us now introduce Henry Sotheran. Henry Sotheran's rare booksellers occupying a treasured part of the London scene. I've never been there, but I've studied it on maps. Sackville Street. Describe it to us over the several hundred years where Sotheran has been there, Oliver.
So Sotheran's hops around London over its history, and it ends up in Sackville Street. They moved there because they were promised it would be redeveloped into a hotspot shopping location. They were the only business that moved there, and everyone forgot that it was supposed to become a destination. And so it kind of just nestled into the basements of somewhere between 2 and 5. Nobody is quite sure which number it occupies, so we're now 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it squats on the right as you head off Piccadilly into Sackville Street, occupying the basement and the ground floors. And it's been there for really as long as anyone can remember, as long as that building's been there.
It's right off of Piccadilly, so it has a lot of foot traffic around it. It's well placed. Are there other rare booksellers in the immediate vicinity? Because I think you described 5 sandwich shops and a retro clothier. Are there other booksellers?
Yeah. There are some within spitting distance, in slightly more well-established streets, perhaps, or well-appointed streets, maybe. We've got Peter Harrington's is down the road from us, and I said you can walk to Jarndyce from where we are in theory. Mag's Brothers was in the area, so it's an area of booksellers, but we're the only one in our little area of Piccadilly.
Before we go into the shop at Oliver's first day, I want to spend some time talking about the strange roads of London. Can you drive to Sackville Street? And which way do you enter? And do you ever exit it? I've looked at a picture now. It's not a wide street.
You can try to drive to Sackville Street, and many brave men have attempted this in the course of history. But routinely, the local authority change which direction you're allowed to drive up it. They've done it quite recently, in fact. And so there are always a lot of people driving the wrong way and getting stuck. But even if you can manage it, you'll get trapped in the one-way system, which you may never leave. So up to you, really.
Do people park their cars half on the sidewalk and half on?
Sometimes just perpendicular.
What it looks like on a busy day.
Sometimes they just park right across it. So it's just a barricade halfway down the street. They park wherever they want, whenever they like.
So to our listeners, they should consider visiting Sotheran's, but at the same time, they should park their car nearby and walk to it. That's the safe way to do it.
Oh, if anyone could park anywhere in London, I suggest you walk. It's the best way of doing that. The only real way of getting to a bookstore in the area is by foot. Very brave to take a car.
I want to mention one more detail about Sackville Street before we enter the shop. This is an extremely expensive part of London, isn't it, Oliver? Aren't we talking about, if you have to ask, you're not rich enough?
Obscenely. In fact, I don't think you could even, the numbers, you just hear static when someone says them to you. That's how bad it is. Thankfully, we're quite entrenched. But any building less courageous than Sotheran's, I think, would be faded away a long time ago.
And so we're looking at a very refined part of London with everything extremely expensive either to purchase or buy. But we're going to enter to the world of rare booksellers when we come back. The book is Once Upon a Tome. Oliver's described what it's like to be offsite. What is it like as his first day committing himself to being an apprentice at a rare bookseller in London? The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller is the subtitle. It is extremely well written and it is charming, but at the same time, it's a world that I did not know existed. That is inside a rare bookseller's shop. You enter into this, and I kept having moments thinking I was entering into a Twilight Zone episode, that the 21st century would disappear and I would be in the 18th century and all these books would be new. Oliver had a first day at Sotheran's, answering what looked to be an opportunity for an apprentice. Oliver, can you take us to that moment that you opened the door, your experiences, what you saw, what it felt like? Thank you.
Well, initially I tried to open the wrong door. There's a double door coming into Sotheran's, and they keep one locked at all times for literally no reason. So I opened that one, I didn't, and I slammed into it. And then I, feeling embarrassed myself, walked into the second one. And the atmosphere hits you like a wall as you come into an old bookstore like that. The books muffle the sound. So you can hear the traffic, the noises, people screaming on Piccadilly, and then you enter the store, and it's just silence. And that smell, that velocor, the wistfulness of old books, I think they call it, just hits you like a physical object almost, because you've stepped into a completely new or an old environment. But everyone is working quite studiously around you, almost like you walked into an academic environment or, a museum or something.
And you were there to be an apprentice. Now, that is an unusual occupation compared to what our system is here on the other side of the Atlantic. What does it mean? What does it mean that some of your salary, which was antiquarian, is going to be picked up by the Antiquarian Association? How does it work for you?
Gosh, so an apprenticeship really just means that you're expected to learn on the job, and that you might go into it with no qualifications or no acumen, no expectation that you would know anything, and they would train you and pay you, even only a little, for the job. The Antiquarian Booksellers Association, which is a thing, realized that they were running out of booksellers at one point, it turns out. And they thought that in order to combat this, nobody knew the trade existed. They would pay some bookstores a little, some of the salary to take on people like myself.
And so you walk in with the expectation you're going to be interviewed to see if you suit an antiquarian rare book selling presence. And you're interviewed by, is it James or Andrew who comes
to you?
It's
Andrew who interviews me in the first instance, yeah.
And Andrew sits down and asks a series of questions that strike you as unusual. You're trying to qualify, you're trying to please him. Chiefly what they want to make sure is that you stay longer than 6 weeks and don't run screaming from the establishment. Is that their concern?
It is. They had a bunch of people on the front desk who only stayed a year because they wanted to work in museums or libraries, and they thought a bookstore was a good first step. But the staff couldn't cope with people only staying a year. It was like a blink of the eye to them. They said staff were leaving too fast. This was unreasonable, outrageous. So they wanted someone who was going to stay for a much longer period of time so everyone could adjust to learn their names. That's where I come in.
What are you thinking as you're sitting there being interviewed for an occupation I did not know existed, a rare bookseller? What sort of questions did you think they were going to ask you? What did they ask you? We're trying to educate young people who are interested in being a rare bookseller.
I thought they would ask me about books, or maybe what I read, or what I was interested in selling. And really, he sat me down and he asked me if it was true that I played the trombone. And once he'd ascertained that, he started to chat about the fact that people were leaving the bookstore. Once he'd established that I wanted somewhere to stay and learn, he just sort of went into general conversation. Really, it was the strangest interview I've ever had in my life. No other reference was made to my hastily cobbled together CV at all. He wanted to know I was someone he could work with, spend every day in a desk next to.
Now, desks, that's important, because eventually we have to walk around the shop. I picture, because I've looked for photographs, there's a very attractive website that Oliver helped sponsor in the beginning, but it doesn't give pictures of long aisles of books at 12 or 15 feet high and dark recesses where something might be lurking. What was it like to you? Do you have a memory of that first day?
I do. Imagine a sort of a Victorian gentleman's study with a great big wooden desk in the middle, bookstore surrounding it on all sides filled with books, and then cobble about 10 of those together and just mash them into one building with a staircase in the middle. So they're kind of adjoining each other in a higgledy-piggledy fashion. You've got one person looking at someone else's desk and a pile of books between them. It's about 10 different studies mashed into the same building over several floors. So everyone working at their own desk, but almost if the buildings have been crushed together. It's a very strange phenomenon.
Now, the building itself becomes a character in your book, because I was always ready for you to say there's a door we've discovered behind a stack of books. But first, let's go up the staircase. There's a mezzanine, but there's another establishment on the mezzanine, or was that after it was rebuilt? What was there when you first arrived?
When I first arrived, the mezzanine had already been reclaimed by another business who we never really see, but they stomp a lot. Sotherans did own it at one point about a century ago, but they call it the mezzanine experiment now, and we don't speak of it much. I gather something happened, and we no longer have that floor.
But you can enter it through a secret fire door. I don't know. I got lost. I tried to draw a map.
Oh, yeah. Good luck.
And also important, do you remember looking at the front window the first day and realizing how important it was to guard the tomes in the front window?
Yeah, dangerous, the front window. They have a special awning that comes out. You have to get it with a hooked pole and drag it out over the window. Because of the sunlight, the books in the window are very vulnerable to being hit by the light. And so someone has to come out and yank the awning and drag it out every day and try not to hit anyone as you do so. It's quite the experience. You get good at it after a while. But...
And the accounting in the books, you eventually lead us to where that is. Did you look around you for doors around you where you were eventually going to have to figure out people were hiding? On your first day, I'm trying to imagine what it felt like.
I mean, you can fit a surprising amount of people under a staircase, it turns out. If you can believe that. I didn't notice that the main accountant was there until, because it's shadowy under that staircase, until I realized there was an entire work area kind of stuffed in the shadow of this great grand staircase underneath it where she worked. It was a surprise. I did not expect it.
And you were given, or maybe not the first day, but once the decision was made that we'll take Oliver on as an apprentice, you were now the junior of juniors at an establishment that's several hundred years old and surrounded by books that are probably much older. You were given a desk, and I tried to imagine the desk. You emphasized that it was too small for you. Where was it and how small?
They perched it right in front of the double doors on the way in, about 2 feet back, because you're supposed to be the youngest member of staff. You're the kind of the dog's body. You're the person who gets in the way of people who come in with questions. Stops them irritating everyone else, I suppose. And it was this desk was the way it was described to me by my colleagues. It was made for, they said, a Victorian gentlewoman, and people were smaller, I guess, 100 years ago, and very dainty. And I could not fit underneath it, so I had to kind of ride it side saddle. It's one of my in order to fit anywhere near. I just could this more of a table for me, like a bedside table. This desk, I had to work on it for years.
And you were put towards the front of the shop so that the first person a potential customer or bookseller would come across was you. Is that where you were? Or were you in the back of the shop?
Right at the front, first line of defense, against an onslaught.
All right, here's Oliver, and a desk much too small for him. Would have been small at any era for anyone. And he builds it up. I think you put books under the legs to make it a little taller.
Taller, yeah. I got a chair that was quite low, so I could sort of slide under it. It was a process.
All right, he's in the front of the shop. The door is going to open, and when we come back, we're going to meet the personalities that attend a rare bookseller. And Oliver Darkshire is the first, as he says, the first line of defense, actually, the person to greet the curious. The book is Once Upon a Tome. Oliver Darkshire is the author. The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller, Henry Sotheran Ltd, on Sackville Street in London. I'm John Batchelor. This is a work of nonfiction. Oliver served as an apprentice and then an employee of a very famous Henry Sotheran Ltd, rare bookseller on Sackville Street off Piccadilly in London. As an apprentice, he is put in the front of the establishment. The first line of defense, says Oliver. And so we're going to greet some of the people who come in, the personality types, not by name. And what Oliver learned was their ambition and how to present his opportunities. The first, Oliver, we're going to come to is a smog. What is a smog and what do you do?
So a smog is a kind of collector who wants a little of everything. So they're the kind of collector who might not have a particular special interest, but they want pretty shiny things from almost every category. So the best example of everything. They might want the best Dickens, the most famous Austen. They'll want the best Bronte that they can find, but they might not collect all of them. They just want something to add to their hoard. So whenever you find something special or something that you think is a good example of its field, the best example of its kind, you go to your Smaug and you ring them up and say, oh, well, I just got in a good Orwell. and they'll say yes for my glittering pile of treasures. Thank you very much. So it's about making sure that it's, the best of its kind of a particular genre, if you see what I mean, but not worrying too much about the specifics of what it is.
So they're collectors. And are they sensitive to the condition of the book, to where the book's been, to who owned it before? Is that all part of the conversation?
Yes, it is. I mean, a lot of collectors particularly find condition to be one of the main things they're concerned about these days. A lot of the time, we have to be quite careful that all the books, they're complete, that they are not too damaged, because if someone's going to be adding it to their collection, what they don't want is to be stumble across another better one later. That gets on their nerves. And particularly with Smaugs, you want the best version of it. You have to find and make sure that it's the best one on the market, or the best one that you can find.
So as the apprentice, are you to steer them to your manager or another senior member of the staff? Because we're looking at someone who might not have a modest price range, might be quite extravagant.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, so the way we organize things at Sotheran's is by specialism. So if you can figure out what it is they're missing almost, or what might pique their interest, you can point them to the right person. So I know Gail's got something special in travel at the moment. He got a good, set of travel memoirs in yesterday. I'll point them to him because I know he's just got something in, it's about steering people in the right direction. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yes, because everybody's got specialties. All right. Now, what is a Dracula? What do you do?
So Draculas are obsessed with a single line of thought. They'll say, I like botany, but only herbs, only a specific one. I like tables, only tables of a certain kind. I like war stories, but only from a certain period. And they will buy anything that has anything to do with their subject matter. So you'll buy them the main things, which they'll already have probably, and then you'll spiral outwards, finding them things that are tangentially related to their collections. They build a themed library around a certain thing. And if they're quite, if they're wealthy, these libraries can be quite big. So you end up quite desperate to find things that are even slightly related to the original subject, which is quite fun. And it builds off quite a sort of a good back and forth, I think, over the 20 years or how long it takes to build a library.
And are these regular customers the types, or sometimes they're walk-in for the first time?
Sometimes they'll walk in for the first time, but mostly you want to build a relationship. Like you want someone coming back to you for a second book. Like, oh, you found me that book on trees faster than your competitors did, or I really love that one. Can you find me another? And that's that's money that comes in every time they walk in the store. And eventually you start offering them, finding things for them. If they've bought 4 or 5 things, you might find a 6th, even if they haven't asked, and say, oh, I've located a copy of this. Do you want it? And invariably they do. So it is a continuing back and forth.
Mrs. Hawthorne, what is a book runner, and do you depend upon them?
Book runners they're the lifeblood, really, of the antiquarian book trade. Because booksellers are often stuck in the store, we can't or go out as often as we would like to find more books, and we need stock to keep going. So book runners form this interim, or they will go to the far end of the country or even abroad sometimes to find books to bring to us and sell them to us for a profit, which we then sell onwards at an even higher price. And they're essential. Mrs. Hawthorne was one of those.
So you don't have to go through the woods in a provincial state, out of a provincial station to a crenellated house that may or may not be haunted. Right. You can depend on the book runner to bring the book to you.
Exactly. Fewer cursed locations. Great day for me. So,
and now some of the things that Oliver was taught to watch for. Who is, or what is Spindelman?
So the Spindelman is an archetype in the book. There are book runners who will often bring you lots of things that you don't want and one thing that you do. And the dance is to turn away the things that you don't want, which they bring every single time on a huge cart. And ideally get the 1 or 2 things that they have that are, definitely worthwhile to you, while still maintaining their custom. You don't want them taking the good stuff to another book dealer. So it's a dance with a book runner like the Spindelman to get the good stuff from them and not take the miles and miles of stuff they want that definitely not worth it.
And one day the Spindelman walked into something that made Andrew lose his sense of proportion. It was a copy of Henry Fielding's Joseph Andrews. Am I right to say you've got a weak spot for that, Andrew? Joseph Andrews?
Yes, I know. I just like the tales. I think they're funny. It's a rare thing to find in complete form as well. And when you find a book that's as old as that, sort of a few centuries old, with all the plates in it in the right order, it's quite unusual, a book of stories like that, because often the plates were removed, or the binder was lazy and did them wrong, or the covers have fallen off. So to find a complete set of stories of that period, all the plates in the right place, is got to watch out for those.
Yes, you get very fussy too if the plate number 2 is missing. You've got to check. Yes,
that's a process,
Oh, this is a good time for us to talk about books that are incomplete or not in great shape. You have, or there was in the store while you were there, Edwin Drood. What condition was it in?
Well, I stumbled across it because I was looking for something else and I felt something wet on the shelf, and that's never a good sign in a bookstore. You don't want to feel wet. It's the one thing you don't want. Damp is bad. Moist is not where you want to be. And so I pulled out this book. It had been put in a case, which had grown mold over it. Turns out some fungus crept in over the years. We hadn't been looking. So I had to divest this book of the case, not knowing what it was. The name had been eroded. And it turned out someone had left a set of the parts of Edwin Drood, sort of Dickens's unfinished work, in the original very, very fragile paper parts inside this box, which mercifully had survived. So I recovered them, jettisoned the box before the fungus could spread. And they're still in a drawer somewhere waiting for identification, because we're not really sure who they belong to.
I got very, very excited to think that you'd found a copy of the finished Edwin Drood. That's what I imagined you to reach behind.
Oh, I hoped. I'd be a much richer man, I feel.
Oh, yes. Heavens. We have a few more types to walk in, but I want to return to the nature of being an apprentice. And one day, apparently, your government sends around people to interview how the apprenticeship is going. Is this?
Yes, they outsource it to a company, I feel, who manages it. But yes, essentially, they send someone around to check on it and make sure we're ticking all the boxes of an apprenticeship, which they see very differently to the way we saw it.
Yes, this is fascinating. So a young person named Kylie shows up carrying a coffee cup. And is it James or Andrew who has a heart attack when he sees the coffee cup?
James almost throws her out on the spot. Coffee in the bookstore? Madam, no. I think he said, Madam, no. I think that was his only exclamation.
And the questions were quite presentable, and you passed the test.
Oh, we passed the test, it turns out, because she lost the will to live, I think, about an hour into the interview, when she was like, can you use a till? And we said, well, our till's not really 21st century. And by the time she got to the bottom of our list, she was sort of ticking boxes in order to get out of the building.
She wanted to know if they were taking good care of you.
I think so, yeah.
Did you tell her that you didn't know where the rubbish went?
I didn't. No, I didn't want to confess that. Did we ever really find out? James was recycling it, as I say, which is one way of putting it. And I say recycling in the sense that he would go through the bins and make sure that he approved of the stuff that was being thrown out. And if not, it would be rehomed elsewhere in the store.
Another type of customer who comes in. Remember, Oliver's at the front of the store. He has to read all of this, or as he does not, I can imagine his seniors are highly entertained by Oliver bumbling, not to know what to do. But you learn very quickly. And one day in the life of Henry Sotheran's, you never know who's coming through the door. A very well-dressed, and what I take it is a prosperous Mrs. comes through and says she wants to buy a nice book for her husband for a gift. Now, go into full bookseller mode. What do you say, Oliver?
Well, firstly, you stare at them blankly and hope they give you more information. And when they inevitably don't, you say, well, what does your husband read? And she tells me, I don't know. So you say, well, books, presumably. And she says, well, I don't really know what's on the shelf. Can you show me something? So you sort of kind of waft around the store until you see something that recognition flash in their face. You want to see something they recognize. And once you're in the right area of the store, you can start pulling things off the shelves, saying maybe this author, and you kind of suggest authors until again you see they say, yes, I know that one. And you kind of walk them through it with colors and shapes and names until you find something that they know, and then you can spread out and make suggestions. So
I go to the Sotheran website, which I invite everybody to go to right now. It's very attractive. And Oliver had a heavy hand in starting this social media of Sotheran. So you don't actually have to find Sackville Street off of Piccadilly in order to see that they're selling something James Rolfe, The Naval Chronology of Great Britain, or an historical account of naval and maritime events from the commencement of the war in 1803 to the end of, £5,250. I would pounce on that immediately, Oliver. I'm very glad I can't walk this right now. Now, am I the kind of customer you count on? You know, a sucker for historical details like this?
If I say yes, is that bad?
No, I can see it. We also have here Charles Robert Darwin, Robert Fitzroy, and Philip Parker King, narrative of the surveying voyages of the Majesty's ships Adventure and Beagle between years 1826 and 1836, £70,000, a bargain. Good heavens.
Lay our hooks very carefully.
Now, when people come through and say, I don't know what I'm looking for, but what have you got for me that you'll think very interesting? Do you guide them to Darwin? Do you guide them to the naval chronology? How do you say, what are you reading? What are you interested in?
Yeah, you start with kind of departments. You kind of get an idea of whether or not, you know, it's literature, whether it's nonfiction, and then you kind of divide from there. You say, is it a sciencey thing? Once you've got a general idea, if they say, oh, it's science, I love the biological sciences, then you start with the obvious. You start with maybe Darwin and see if they have any already. And you start with the big things, and then you can move on to Alfred Russel Wallace and stuff. You need to sort of you can spread out from there. Sort of direct them to the right bookseller who has a specialism. It's about sort of getting a feel for what subject they're interested in, and then sort of just starting with the big things and spreading out.
There are unpleasant things that happen at a rare bookseller. We're going to tell only one, however, because Oliver was designated to be part of the solution. Apparently, book thieves practice on Sackville Street. And I imagine this happened several times, but one day a book thief comes through who everybody knows is a book thief, and you're designated to follow him around the store. Was that your work?
Well, yeah, James used to say that you couldn't interrupt someone, obviously, if they hadn't actually stolen anything in front of you, naturally, but he would put these hazy CCTV images on the wall, which nobody else could decipher, and then sort of point out people when they came in if he knew them. And because you couldn't obviously walk in front of someone and say, you're a thief, when they haven't taken anything, you had to kind of just shadow them. And when I say shadow, you kind of move in the shadows around the bookstore, so you're always somewhere in line of sight. They could see you on line of sight, but never so claustrophobic because then they could accuse you of following them. So there's an art to it, to shadowing someone around a bookstore.
You mentioned shadows, and before we turn to the Antiquarian Association that partly sponsored your apprenticeship, the store has a ghost. I believe it's a Sotheran, right? And what is the story of the ghost?
Yes, the last Sotheran, the last Henry Sotheran, in the line of Sotherans who used to own the store, middle of the last century, he walked out of the store one day. He may or may not have been drinking and was hit by a tram in Piccadilly. I was immediately setting out the store, a bit like Looney Tunes. He stepped out of the store right into the street, and a train, wrong moment, came into him. And ever since, the legend is that he haunts the bookstore, dissatisfied with his fate. And he will rattle bookshelves and throw books off shelves at a random moment. Things will fall off that shouldn't. Rattle pipes. He's decent for a ghost.
And you mentioned at one point that a room full of book boxes make noise. They shift themselves, and you think that's the ghost?
Yes, sometimes. I mean, things, shelves will open that are locked or have catches on them that shouldn't, and things fall out of them or off them. Things make noises and rustle in the basement sometimes. That there's nothing down. There's no wind down there. They shouldn't be moving unless something is moving them. So yeah. Anyway, the easiest explanation is it's a ghost. So that's what we go with.
Oliver Darkshire is the author of the new book, Once Upon a Tome, The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller. We're going off-site again. We're going to the city of York, which has a gathering of antiquarian booksellers each year. And Oliver was designated to go and attend because they were partly his sponsor. When we return, Henry Sotheran is the rare bookseller, the antiquarian bookseller on Sackville Street. And on the website now, which I invite everybody to examine, they are very pleased and excited by Oliver publishing this book. It's neatly featured in the website. You can buy it through, in British terms. It isn't as easy as Amazon would be, but right now you can buy it. There's a picture of the cover of his book, published in the US by Norton. We go now to one of Oliver's educations in becoming a rare bookseller, which was to attend in the city of York the Antiquarian Booksellers Association. Who are they? What did they want from you? And what is it like to be with other rare booksellers?
So York, it turns out, is almost historically as big as London when it comes to antiquarian bookselling. And they're everywhere in York. And so every year they hold the Antiquarian Book Seminar to try and encourage more people into the trade so booksellers can learn from each other. They hold lectures. And because I was the apprentice, sponsored by the Nationwide Association of Booksellers who hold this event, they said, you should go. We'll pay for your ticket and your train up there. And that'll be a good learning experience for you, young apprentice. So off I went, off my train up to York, ended up in a very suspicious bed and breakfast with very dodgy food. But mostly it was several days of sitting in a room with booksellers from stores I was familiar with, stores I was not familiar with, you know, holding these seminars on what it meant to be a bookseller, what to buy, what to sell.
And can you characterize people who become booksellers? At some point you say your powers. Oliver calls the people who own Southerans these days powers. Sponsor lots of fetes. You know, I picture wine parties, something like that off-site. But that booksellers themselves don't much show up because they're not convivial. They don't make good small talk.
I think you have to be a certain kind of person to fall into bookselling, and I think part of that is being happy spending a lot of your day by yourself with books, you know, surrounded in a desk with talking to no one, and that doesn't necessarily produce a curmudgeon so much as it's a good environment for someone who's quite reclusive to be in, like myself. And some people do that and parties very well, but personally, and you know, a lot of my friends and colleagues, the kind of party is not necessarily our strong point. Mass socializing in a huge group of people, you know, want to be surrounded by my books all day. Not necessarily a party person.
Oh, it sounds heavenly, Oliver, which is why I like your book so much. That at one point, Southern is rebuilt, which is a great challenge to everybody who works there. But after it's rebuilt, was it after or before the health and safety inspector came by?
So it was sort of almost in the process of afterwards, really. We'd had part of the store redeveloped and rejigged around. It happens every century or so. We have to do some work on it. And yeah.
He asked a number of really uncomfortable questions. How did you pass that interview, or did you?
The poor man was grey by the time he finished. He came in with a clipboard looking so hopeful. And by the time he'd asked about the ladders and about the light bulb situation and about, you know, the whatever was going on in the basement and the flooding, like he looked like he hadn't ticked a single box, and he was trying to show us videos about how to lift boxes and kind of in desperation by the end. They were like, that's not how anyone does it here. He left in a fugue state.
And I would want my rare bookseller to be unrecognizable to health and safety inspectors. I mean, you're not going to find something you really want if everything's all lit up.
Part of the principle, you know.
Now, in your reflection now that you've left Southerans for a moment, but you're a rare bookseller, your moments of joy at Southerans were when they gave you a new desk and took it away right away. Do you have a desk that fits you now, Oliver?
I do, eventually. It took 7 or 8 years, but I finally convinced them to spring for a desk I can sit under. So it makes me very happy. I had ups and downs in my relationship with my desk, but finally happily married to a good solid oak device.
I recommend Oliver's book if you're a book lover, as I am, and also if you've ever tried to imagine what it would be like to be a rare bookseller. You know, the path's not taken. The book is Once Upon a Tome. Oliver Darkshire is the author. I'm John Batchelor.